Hi everyone, I'm Jayne Brown. I'm one of the lead consultants at Simplify, and I'm joined by Dom, who is also a lead consultant at Simplify. Earlier this year in March, we both attended the TISA Vulnerability Conference, where we were both involved in a fireside chat talking about vulnerability and how it's embedded within customer journeys and processes, and our thoughts and opinions around that through our experience of working with our clients, in particular, working with them focused on operational excellence and risk and regulation. So we wanted to record this today just to sort of be able to push out our conversation a bit further. So, Dom, where do you see the maturity within wealth management regarding vulnerability?
So I think at the TISA conference that we attended, I think there was a lot of discussion about where the overall maturity is across the wealth management industry. And there's definitely some good pockets of discussion and where firms are showing some good examples of best practice. But across the whole of the industry, there's still quite a low level of maturity. So we know that there's a significant number of firms that are still not identifying any customers as vulnerable. And, you know, by definition, alongside what the FCA have said about how many potentially vulnerable customers are out there, that just is not going to be the case. So I think there's still a lot of work to do to identify vulnerability, to work out how firms are going to treat vulnerability. I think on top of that, one of the things that we wanted to highlight was how much kind of inherent vulnerability there is within wealth management, because ultimately, when customers are interacting with, their wealth products, they start on the whole from a position of quite low levels of understanding and knowledge, and therefore it is always a challenge for them to really have that level of understanding that the that their product provider, their service provider has. And I think as an industry, we make it very difficult for customers to actually kind of self-identify vulnerability, or even just to say, I don't really understand this. I need some more help. I need some more guidance. So I would say, yes, there's more work to be done on vulnerability itself, but there's also more work to be done just to understand the customer, understand their level of competency around the wealth products, their literacy, their numeracy skills. I think all need to be taken into account.
Yeah, and so this is what the FCA are aiming towards with Consumer Duty, isn't it? Like the language and helping people to understand what it actually is.
Yes, correct. So there's obviously consumer understanding is part of the four outcomes of consumer duty, and it's obviously very linked in and closely tied with vulnerability conversations. Even if vulnerability kind of predates consumer duty, they're really both aiming towards the same point. I think we're at a point where consumer duty has been in place for a year or so now, and that's there's been some great evidence of implementation, but there's still a lot of work to do to actually embed consumer duty within organizations, within BAU, and actually kind of understand what the consequences are of the principle and the outcomes that they're driving towards.
Yeah, so you mentioning about the kind of customer understanding and like, the product providers, obviously having that knowledge of the products and therefore customers kind of vulnerable before they've even started. Um, are you saying that everyone should just be considered as vulnerable then? Because they're always going to be kind of not as knowledgeable in certain areas as others.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard some people almost flippantly say, "Oh, why don't we just treat everyone as vulnerable?" As a way to kind of undermine vulnerability, because they kind of say, well, what's the point of vulnerability if everyone should just be treated vulnerable if 50% of customers are, showing vulnerable traits, etc. But actually, that's not a bad starting point to come from, where you say, actually, whenever I'm having an interaction with a customer, I need to go through the process of um, treating them as if they could be vulnerable, that they may not understand what I'm telling them. They might need more time to make decisions. They might need additional support. I mean, that's not to say that there isn't, vulnerability is obviously a thing, and there are, you know, things that, as you know, support that's going to be required for certain types of vulnerability that do need to be put in place by firms. But actually, the idea of just saying let's start from that low level of kind of customer understanding and build up from there is not actually a bad thing at all.
But then if everyone's vulnerabilities are shifting, and we know that it's so difficult already to define, I mean, how do firms cope with that?
Mm. Yeah, so obviously some vulnerabilities, it can be quite obvious when there's certain vulnerabilities, but equally a lot of vulnerabilities are less obvious, they are less present, and they're also temporary as well. So it is a massive challenge to go through that process. I mean, it, really, it's about the firms um, developing the processes, developing the customer touch points so that they can identify particular customer traits, particular customer vulnerabilities, and develop them from there. I think we have seen some really good examples over the last year or 18 months of how firms are kind of trying to develop their approach to vulnerability. So it's not always just, oh, I can hear in the customer's voice that they potentially are unsure or they need some additional support. It's actually also about using the rest of the tools around that uh, to identify vulnerability. So things like gambling addiction might lead to a certain pattern of withdrawals from accounts. So firms can use that kind of data to identify potential vulnerabilities and potentially take action where it's needed to to look for those kind of hidden vulnerabilities and address them where they're present.
Yeah. And what about the other way around then? So obviously there's when the customer contacts the firm. We've talked about that, but what about when the firm's contacting the customer? What considerations do there need to be with that?
Yeah, so that's another challenge, isn't it? So the kind of outputs that we send can be inherently quite complex. You think about things like fees and charges schedules, valuations and statements, things like that. There's obviously within them, some quite complex information. There's quite a lot of numbers often. There's quite difficult to understand factors. So I think we do need to take more care and attention to develop those outputs so that they're more easily understandable, but equally on top of that, make it a lot easier for customers um, to come back where they're not sure, where they might have further clarification. And that doesn't necessarily have to be because they're a vulnerable customer in the kind of traditional sense. It can be any customer that can have that, and use more resources that we have available to explain things in different ways, whether that's using audio or visuals or video, not just relying on kind of that kind of written communication. So yeah, it's kind of seeing that communication in the round and kind of understanding how customers might receive it and how they might want different resources available.
And I think customers, well, I think we both know, don't we? Like communications, correspondence is an issue for a lot of firms, like to get it right, because, even without the vulnerability factor, customers find comms very difficult to understand because of
Hmm.
the language used and so on. So it kind of ties back to your treat everyone as vulnerable from a
Hmm.
knowledge perspective. Some of those communications that we push out as an industry just a gobbledygook, aren't they, to people? They just don't
Mm.
understand what they need to do. So without the vulnerability, we know it's a challenge. So you add in the complexities of vulnerability as well.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think a lot of the time that firms actually start a lot of this work from a position of what do they need. So
hmm,
so what am I asking the customer? What kind of information do I need to complete this process or fulfill a customer request? What we need to do is start flipping that on its head and start talking about what the customer needs and how we can
yeah.
support them. And that can apply to outputs. It can also apply to, processes that we spend a lot of time at Simplify doing. A lot of the time we're sat with, SMEs, etc., who are very knowledgeable about the process, understand the systems and what needs to happen. But we always try and reframe that conversation to talk about what the customer need is within that customer journey.
Yeah. And what about any further sort of interaction around the vulnerability within those processes and journeys? Is there
Mm.
anything else that you've seen or would recommend?
Well, I can give another example of where there is, I think, often a, a kind of a focus on the business need or a focus on making processes nice and neat.
Yeah.
When we do process flows, often the start of the process flow is coming from the customer. It's that first customer interaction, that first touch point where they might be sending in a request or something like that. And what we always see is that we have, here's the line that shows what's going to happen if the customer phones. Here's the line what happens if the customer goes on the portal or writes a letter or whatever the communication channels are going to be. But actually, the reality of the situation is more complex than that. And as we move into a more digital future, we should start developing process flows which outline the true nature of how customers interact. So they
Mm.
may start on a portal, but they might get to a point where they have a question or not sure what to do. They might want to call and ask a question. Processes and customer journeys that have been mapped out don't always take into account the fact that actually that a better process for the customer is that they don't have to switch between channels and then start all over again and put in the same information. It'd be great if there was a more seamless way of the customer interacting, because you know we should be in a multi-channel um, propositions really now. But actually, the multi-channel proposition needs to work for the customer, not just work for the firm.
Yeah. And how can technology support that then? So not just the channels, but
Yeah. So I think we need to be. I think technology is a really interesting part of vulnerability because we've spent a lot of time over the last kind of 10, 15, 20 years automating processes, taking the human element out of it. I think what we need to do is recognize that vulnerability, yes, there are some great use cases for where technology can help with vulnerability, but equally we need to understand that vulnerability at its heart a human to human interaction. So yes, automation can be really good. It can make things better from the customer and the firm. It can reduce cost. It can make things smoother, get requests done more quickly. But equally, if it takes out that ability to identify vulnerabilities to address additional support needs, then actually it can be counterproductive from a vulnerability perspective.
mm,
So firms need to challenge themselves to say, when we're putting in kind of new technology and automation, where does vulnerability sit within this? Because it's not always the case that more technology is going to be a good thing.
yeah. Well, thanks very much, Dom, for sharing all your thoughts. It was good to sort of revisit our conversation. Um, if you'd like to hear more or see any more of our insights, then please go to our website at simplifyconsulting.co.uk. Thanks for listening and bye, everyone.